The vase shattered before anyone could stop me. Not by accident, not in anger. I simply lifted it from its silk cushion in the grand hall and let it fall, porcelain exploding across marble like 1,000 broken promises. My stepmother's scream could have woken the dead. "Emma, do you have any idea what you've done?" I did, perfectly. That vase, the Harrington family's so-called treasure, their mystical source of prosperity for 3 generations, was nothing more than a pretty lie wrapped in superstition. But they'd believed in it so deeply that they'd sacrificed everything to protect it, including me. I stood there in my 16-year-old body, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light filtering through the windows, and felt something close to peace. My hands were steady, my heartbeat was calm, the chaos erupting around me, servants gasping, my father rushing from his study, my stepsister Victoria clutching her throat in theatrical horror. All of it felt distant, like watching a play I'd already seen. Because I had seen it, all of it, every moment of the next 12 years. In my first life, I'd lived to 28. I died alone in a hospital room that smelled of bleach and regret, my body ravaged by an illness that could have been treated if anyone had cared enough to notice I was sick. By then, the Harrington family had written me out of their story so completely that my death went unannounced. No funeral, no obituary. Just a quiet disposal of an inconvenient daughter who'd never quite fit their narrative. The vase had still been intact when I died, protected, worshipped, more valuable to them than I'd ever been. They say some families are cursed. The Harringtons would have argued they were blessed. My father, Richard Harrington, inherited both a failing textile business and an ancient porcelain vase when his father died. Within a year, the business turned profitable. Within 5, the Harringtons were one of the wealthiest families in the state. Coincidence, obviously. My grandfather had been a drunk who drove the company into the ground. My father was sober and competent. But the family preferred their fairy tale. The vase brought fortune. Break it, and ruin would follow. My mother died when I was 3. I barely remembered her, just fragments of warmth and the scent of lavender. My father remarried quickly. He needed a mother for his daughter, he said. What he really needed was someone to manage his social calendar and give him the son he'd always wanted. Helena entered our lives like a storm dressed in Chanel, beautiful, calculating, and already pregnant. She gave birth to Victoria 6 months after the wedding, and if my father suspected the timing was convenient, he never said so. He was too enamoured with finally having a perfect family, a beautiful wife and a daughter who looked like a porcelain doll herself. I was the ghost in their photograph, the one they cropped out when the frame wasn't big enough. Victoria was everything I wasn't, golden-haired, delicate, quick to tears that made adults rush to comfort her. She learned early that vulnerability was currency, and she spent it extravagantly. When we were children, she'd break her own toys and blame me. I'd be punished for my jealousy while she received replacements, tears drying on her cheeks as she smiled at her new prizes. I learned to be invisible. It was safer that way. The vase sat in the grand hall on a pedestal of white jade, enclosed in a glass case that was cleaned daily. 18th century Qing dynasty, pale green with painted cranes ascending toward clouds. It was exquisite. It was also a prison. No one could touch it without permission. The case was locked, and only my father held the key. Once a year, on the anniversary of my grandfather's death, he would open the case and spend an hour staring at it, whispering what I assumed were prayers or promises. The rest of the year, we walked past it like worshippers passing a shrine. When I was 10, a maid accidentally bumped the pedestal while cleaning. Nothing happened to the vase. It didn't even wobble, but she was fired within the hour. I watched her collect her things from the servants' quarters, her face streaked with tears, and asked my father if that was fair. Fair? He'd looked at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. Emma, that vase is our family's heart. Without it, we'd lose everything. Would you risk your home, your education, your future for one careless woman? I was 10. I didn't know how to argue with that logic, so I stayed silent. Silence became my language, the tongue I spoke when Victoria took credit for my ideas in school, when Helena redecorated my bedroom without asking, replacing everything I loved with furniture that matched the house's aesthetic. When my father forgot my birthday 3 years in a row but threw Victoria elaborate parties with orchestras and ice sculptures, I told myself it didn't matter. I'd go to college, build my own life, escape. But escape required resources. And in the Harrington house, resources flowed through my father's approval, which Helena controlled like a gatekeeper. When I was 16, my first 16, I'd asked my father about college funds. He'd been vague, distracted. We'll discuss it later, Emma. I'm handling something important. Later never came. When acceptance letters arrived from universities across the country, Helena presented him with a problem. Victoria wanted to attend an expensive music conservatory in Europe. The tuition was astronomical. Sending both of us to school would be difficult. Emma can go to state college, Helena had said, her hand on my father's shoulder. She's always been so practical. Victoria has real talent. It would be cruel to waste it. My father had nodded. Just like that, my future was halved. I'd gone to state college, lived in a cramped apartment, worked 3 jobs, graduated with honours that no one from my family attended to witness. I tried to build something for myself, a career in art restoration, ironically. I loved bringing beauty back to broken things, but Helena had other plans. Victoria's career hadn't flourished in Europe. She'd returned home at 22, directionless and expensive. She needed a job, Helena insisted, something respectable. And I'd just secured a position at a prestigious museum. The calls started. Helena, reaching out to the museum director, a man whose wife moved in Helena's social circles, lunch meetings, casual mentions of how Victoria was Richard Harrington's daughter. The real daughter, the one whose success reflected well on the family name. I'd been let go 6 months later. Budget cuts, they said. Victoria was hired the following week. I spiralled after that. Depression was a quiet drowning. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating properly. The illness that eventually killed me might have started then, or maybe it had been waiting all along. By the time I was diagnosed, the cancer had spread too far. Treatment was expensive. I had no insurance. I called my father from the hospital. I need help, he'd sighed. Emma, you're always so dramatic. Helena said you're just trying to get attention. We can't enable this behaviour. They thought I was lying about being sick. That was how thoroughly Helena had rewritten me in their minds, as a jealous, unstable girl who'd do anything to steal focus from perfect Victoria. I died at 28, alone, erased. And then I woke up at 16, in my childhood bedroom, sunlight streaming through curtains I'd forgotten existed. The rebirth wasn't gentle. I woke, gasping, my body young and strong, but my mind full of decades of pain. For 3 days, I didn't leave my room. I tested my memories obsessively. Dates, conversations, the exact words Helena had used when she'd convinced my father to choose Victoria's dreams over mine. Everything was intact. I remembered it all. I also remembered the day the vase would secure its hold on my father forever. Victoria's 18th birthday party, 2 years from now in the original timeline. A grand affair where a business rival would attend and, impressed by the Harrington wealth, would propose a merger that would triple my father's fortune. He'd credit the vase in his speech. Our family's luck holds, he'd say, raising a champagne glass toward the grand hall where the vase presided over the celebration like a silent god. After that night, The vase wouldn't just be superstition. It would be proof. I couldn't let that happen. But I was 16, powerless, monitored. Helena watched me like a hawk watched a rabbit, always ready to reframe any action I took as evidence of my defects. I needed to be strategic. First, I stopped fighting. When Victoria took my homework and presented it as her own, I smiled and started keeping duplicate copies. When Helena criticised my clothes, my posture, my friends, I nodded and said nothing. I became a shadow again, but this time a shadow with purpose. I started documenting everything, every conversation, every slight, every financial detail I could access. My father kept his study locked, but I'd learned in my first life that Helena had a copy of his keys. She kept them in her jewellery box, under the velvet tray. I waited until they went to a charity gala, then carefully borrowed them long enough to make impressions in soap. A locksmith in the next town over didn't ask questions when a teenage girl paid cash for copies. I told him they were for my grandmother's house. He'd shrugged and handed them over within a week. My father's files were meticulous. Tax returns, investment portfolios, trust documents. I photographed everything with a camera I'd bought from a pawn shop, hands shaking but steady enough. What I found was illuminating. There was no magical fortune. The business thrived because my father was talented and worked with excellent advisors. The vase was coincidental, but more importantly, I found my mother's will. She'd left everything to me, a substantial trust fund meant to be released when I turned 18. But the will had a clause. If my father remarried and his new wife had children, he'd gain control of the trust as my guardian until I was 25, to ensure family harmony and prevent resentment. My mother, in her kindness, had inadvertently given my father a reason to keep me small. As long as I remained dependent and manageable, he could use my inheritance to fund Victoria's lifestyle. The conservatory tuition, the expensive apartment in Europe, the loans she never repaid, all of it came from money my mother had meant for me. Helena had known. I found correspondence between her and my father's lawyer, dated just months after my mother's death, discussing the trust's potential. My father had married Helena for money. My money. The rage that should have consumed me felt cold and clean. I couldn't afford heat. Not yet. I continued my performance. I let them believe I was the same oblivious Emma, quietly suffering, never quite understanding why I was treated as the lesser. I joined the school art club and actually showed up, creating a social network separate from Victoria's crowd. I befriended the children of my father's business associates. Not openly, just enough that they'd remember me kindly. I started tutoring, saving money. Small amounts, but growing. I opened a bank account in the next town over, one Helena couldn't access or even know about, and I waited for the perfect moment. It came on a Saturday in October. My father was hosting a business dinner, potential investors for a new venture. Helena had been preparing for weeks, orchestrating every detail to perfection. Victoria had a new dress, custom made. The house gleamed. The vase, naturally, was the centerpiece of conversation. My father loved telling its story to guests, the legend of the Harrington luck. That evening, over cocktails in the grand hall, he was gesturing toward it with proprietary pride. 3 generations, he was saying to a silver-haired man I recognized as the CEO of a major investment firm. My grandfather acquired it in Shanghai in 1948, just before the revolution. The dealer told him it carried a blessing, prosperity for those who honoured it. I was sceptical until I walked in carrying a serving tray of appetizers. The hired caterers were overwhelmed, and I'd volunteered to help, playing the dutiful daughter. Helena had barely noticed, too busy monitoring Victoria's charm offensive on the CEO's son. I crossed the hall. My hands were steady, the tray balanced perfectly, and then I stumbled. Not really, but it looked real. My foot caught on the Persian rug, the tray tilted, and I reached out to catch myself. My hand grabbed the glass case. The lock clicked. My father had opened it that morning for his ritual and forgotten to lock it. I'd watched him walk away, distracted by a phone call. I'd been waiting for this mistake for 3 weeks. The case door swung open. The vase wobbled. "Emma, careful!" My father's voice was sharp with alarm. I looked directly at him, then at the vase, then back at him, and I let go of the case door, reaching instead for the vase itself. Time became liquid. I saw my father lunge forward, saw Helena's mouth open in a scream that hadn't yet reached sound, saw Victoria frozen in horror that was almost genuine. The vase was lighter than I expected, delicate, centuries old and somehow fragile despite surviving so long. I wondered, in that frozen moment, if my mother had ever been allowed to touch it. Then I dropped it. The sound of shattering porcelain was a gunshot in the silence. Pieces skittered across marble, cranes breaking mid-flight, clouds dissolving into shards. The jade pedestal stood empty, a throne without a king. Helena screamed, actually screamed, the sound raw and inhuman. My father stood paralyzed, his face draining of colour. The guests stared in collective shock. I set down the tray carefully and looked at my father. "I'm sorry, it slipped." 3 words. No tears, no panic. Just those 3 words in a voice so calm it was almost surreal. "You..." Helena was advancing on me, her face twisted. "You stupid, clumsy, worthless... It was an accident," I said again, still calm. My father finally moved. He knelt beside the pieces, hands hovering over them, like they might reassemble through will alone. "The vase," he whispered. "The family fortune." The silver-haired CEO cleared his throat. "Richard, I'm sure it was certainly valuable, but surely not... You don't understand." My father's voice broke. "Everything we have, everything we've built, it came from this." I watched him cradle a piece of painted porcelain, saw the exact moment his mind chose magical thinking over reality. He needed the vase to be magic, because if it wasn't, then he'd have to acknowledge that he was simply a competent businessman who'd sacrificed his daughter to superstition and his second wife's greed. The dinner ended early. Guests left with murmured apologies and backward glances. Helena sent me to my room without dinner, her voice shaking with rage. Victoria cried, actual tears this time, I noted. Perhaps she'd actually believed in the vase's power. I went upstairs, closed my door, and waited. The consequences started small. A business deal fell through the following week, a deal that had been shaky anyway, but my father blamed the broken vase. An investment performed badly. Again, bad luck, but my father saw patterns where there were none. Helena blamed me vocally and often. At dinner, she'd recount the breaking like it was a murder. Our luck is gone. Emma destroyed it. Everything we lose now is her fault. Victoria joined in. I don't know how you can even show your face. Don't you feel guilty? I ate my meals in silence, let them build their narrative. I knew what was coming. I'd seen it all before. What I hadn't seen was how quickly my father would unravel. In my first life, he'd been cold but stable. Now, untethered from his superstition, he became erratic. He made impulsive business decisions, changed strategies mid-course, trusted the wrong advisors. Helena tried to manage him, but her control had always been built on playing to his ego and his belief in the family's blessed status. Without that foundation, her influence crumbled. 2 months after the vase broke, my father's new venture collapsed. He'd invested heavily in a tech startup that turned out to be smoke and mirrors, a scam sophisticated enough to fool him, but obvious enough that his usual advisors would have caught it. He hadn't consulted them. He'd been too scattered, too desperate to prove the vase's breaking didn't matter. The financial hit was significant, but not devastating. The Harrington fortune was diversified enough to survive. But my father couldn't see it that way. He saw doom. He started drinking. Not constantly, but enough that business associates noticed. Meetings were missed. Opportunities slipped away. Helena threw more elaborate parties, trying to maintain appearances, draining resources to project success while my father deteriorated. I watched it all with careful attention. I was still playing the quiet daughter, but I'd started speaking up in small ways, pointing out obvious problems my father missed, asking innocent questions that highlighted Helena's spending, building credibility through helpfulness. My father barely noticed, but his business partners did. They'd started calling me for information my father was too disorganized to provide. "Emma, what time is the meeting?" "Emma, did your father sign that contract?" "Emma, is everything all right at home?" I was always helpful, always honest. I never spoke against my family. I just provided facts. Victoria's expensive lifestyle became harder to maintain. Helena cut my allowance to zero, punishment for the vase. But ironically, this made my careful savings more valuable. I had money. Victoria didn't. She'd started borrowing from friends, from her boyfriend, a wealthy idiot named Preston whose family money was older than his brain. I befriended Preston's sister, casually. We'd met at an art gallery opening. I never mentioned Victoria. I just talked about restoration techniques and shared sketches from my notebook. She found me interesting. "My brother's girlfriend is so shallow," she'd confided. "You're actually smart." Seeds. I was planting seeds everywhere quietly. The confrontation came at Christmas. My 18th birthday was in January, and I'd been dropping hints that I wanted to discuss college plans. My father had been avoiding me, but at Christmas dinner, with relatives present, he couldn't escape. "I want to apply to the restoration program at the Reinhardt Institute," I said during dessert. "It's extremely competitive, but my portfolio is strong." Helena's fork clinked against her plate. "Emma, we've discussed this. After what you did, after I accidentally broke an object?" I kept my voice level. "That's been 8 months ago. Surely my entire future isn't determined by one mistake." "That object," Victoria said sharply, "was our family's heart." "It was porcelain," I replied. "Beautiful and old, yes. But porcelain?" My father's hand shook as he reached for his wineglass. "You don't understand. Everything we had, we still have," I interrupted gently. "The house, the business, the investments. We've had some setbacks, but we're hardly destitute. Unless there's something I should know about?" The table went silent. My aunt, my father's sister, who'd never liked Helena, leaned forward. "Richard, is there a financial problem?" "No," Helena said quickly. "Emma's exaggerating." "I'm not exaggerating anything. I'm just saying that blaming family misfortune on broken pottery seems..." I paused, choosing my word carefully. "Unscientific." My father's face flushed red. "You think this is a joke? You destroyed something irreplaceable, and now you want me to pay for your expensive school." "I'm not asking you to pay," I said quietly. "I have a trust fund from my mother. It becomes available to me in January." Another silence. This one was different. Heavier. Helena's eyes narrowed. "What trust fund?" I looked directly at her. "The one my mother left me. The one that's been funding Victoria's lifestyle for the past 4 years. The explosion was immediate. Helena denied it. My father stammered. Victoria looked genuinely confused. She'd probably never questioned where her money came from. My aunt, however, looked furious. "Richard, tell me you didn't touch Eleanor's trust for Emma." "It was for family harmony," my father said weakly. The will specified your guardianship of the funds, not authorization to spend them on another child. My aunt was a lawyer. I'd counted on her passing the language correctly. Emma, do you have documentation? I did. Copies of everything, stored in a safe deposit box I'd rented with my tutoring money. I didn't mention that. Not yet. I'm sure we can review it after the holidays, I said smoothly. I just want to make sure I have access to my own inheritance for school. The dinner disintegrated. Relatives took sides. Helena's mask cracked and she revealed the calculating woman underneath. My father retreated into his study with a bottle of scotch. Victoria cornered me afterward. Why are you doing this? Doing what? Existing? Wanting an education? You know what? You've changed. Ever since the vase. Maybe breaking the vase was the best thing that ever happened to me, I said. Maybe I should have done it years ago. Her eyes widened. It wasn't an accident. I smiled. Does it matter now? The legal battle took 3 months. My aunt represented me pro bono, furious at how my father had managed my mother's legacy. We uncovered years of questionable transfers, my trust money paying for Victoria's conservatory, her apartment, her allowances, tens of thousands of dollars that should have been mine. Helena had documented everything meticulously, never imagining it would be used against her. She'd saved receipts like trophies. The court ruled in my favour. My father was ordered to repay what he'd taken, with interest. He'd have to liquidate some investments, downsize. Not ruin, but discomfort, accountability. I used my restored inheritance to attend Reinhardt. Not state college, not some compromise. The exact school I dreamed about in my first life. My father's business continued to decline, not because of a curse, but because he'd lost his focus. Investors lost confidence. Helena's social climbing couldn't compensate for his instability. They sold the house when I was 19, the beautiful mansion with the grand hall, where a Vase had once reigned. I heard Victoria and Preston broke up. Apparently, his sister had mentioned how shallow Victoria seemed compared to that Harrington girl who's into art. Preston had started noticing the same things. How Victoria's interests were surface level. How she borrowed money and forgot to repay it. How she only called when she needed something. I sent Preston's sister a thank you card for her friendship. She invited me to her wedding 2 years later. I went. Preston was there with a new girlfriend, a kind, intelligent woman who restored antique furniture. We talked to the shop for an hour. He seemed happy. Victoria moved back home with my father and Helena. Last I heard, she was working retail and complaining about the unfairness of it all. My aunt stayed in touch. Over coffee one day, she asked, "Did you really break that vase by accident?" I sipped my latte. "Does it matter?" "I suppose not. Your father was always superstitious. Your mother used to laugh about it. She'd say he'd blame the weather on the vase if he could." "Did she believe in it?" "Eleanor? God, no. She was a scientist, a researcher before she had you. She thought the vase was beautiful, but just an object. She worried Richard's obsession with it was unhealthy." I thought about my mother then, a woman I barely remembered, but who'd been intelligent, clear-eyed, practical. She'd left me money to ensure my independence. She'd probably known that Helena wasn't who she appeared to be. "I wish I'd known her better," I said. "She'd be proud of you," my aunt replied. "Standing up for yourself, not letting them make you small." I graduated top of my program. Got offers from museums across the country. I chose one in California, far from the Harrington name and its broken legend. I'm 24 now in this life, younger than I'd been when I died before. I restore beautiful things for a living. I bring broken art back to wholeness. There's poetry in that, I suppose. My father sent a stilted email on my birthday last year. No apology, just updates on his life. He's managing a small consulting firm, doing well enough. Helena is involved in some multi-level marketing scheme, calling herself an entrepreneur. Victoria got engaged to someone she met online. The email was carefully cheerful, like we were a normal family who'd simply drifted apart. I responded politely and briefly. I don't hate them. Hate requires energy I'd rather spend elsewhere. Sometimes people ask about my family, colleagues, friends, dates. I tell them the simple version: we're not close, different values. They usually nod and move on. No one really wants the complicated truth. The complicated truth is that I destroyed my family's fortune by breaking their false idol. I shattered their comfortable delusion and forced them to face reality. There was no magic, there was no blessing, just choices and consequences, and the lazy cruelty of people who found it easier to believe in luck than to acknowledge what they'd sacrificed, to worship it. Did I feel guilty? Sometimes, for about 3 minutes. Then I'd remember dying alone in a hospital room, my family believing I was faking for attention. I'd remember being erased, being cropped from the photograph, being treated as less than porcelain. The vase had been beautiful. I'd appreciated that in the moment before I dropped it. 18th century craftsmanship, delicate painting, centuries of history. It had been worth a fortune, but it had never been worth a daughter. I've never told anyone the full story about the rebirth, the memories, the deliberate choice I made that day in the Grand Hall. It sounds insane. Time travel, second chances, those are fairy tales, and I've learnt to be suspicious of fairy tales. But sometimes, when I'm restoring a particularly damaged piece, a painting torn and stained, a sculpture shattered and scattered, I think about that vase, about how some things can be restored and some things can't, about how sometimes breaking something irreparably is the only way to make space for something new. I think about my mother, who I never really knew, and wonder if she'd understand. If she'd approve of what I did, I like to think she would. She left me resources to build my own life. I just had to destroy an obstacle to access them. The Harrington family still exists, technically. My father, Helena, Victoria, they're all still out there, living their diminished lives. They tell people their luck turned bad. They probably still blame the vase. I let them. Because the real lesson was never about the vase. It was about what they'd been willing to sacrifice to protect it. Their integrity, their daughter, their humanity. They'd thought the vase made them special. In truth, it just made them blind. I have a small apartment now overlooking the ocean. I bought it myself with my first year's salary. Sometimes I stand on the balcony in the evening watching the sun set over water and feel something that might be peace. I'm not the girl I was in my first life, broken down and erased. I'm not even the girl I was at 16 when I woke up with a second chance. I'm someone I built carefully, deliberately, from the shattered pieces of who I was supposed to be. My victory wasn't revenge. Revenge would have been explosive, dramatic, satisfying in the moment, and empty afterward. What I achieved was quieter and more permanent. I outgrew them. I outgrew the need for their approval. I outgrew the belief that family meant accepting cruelty. I outgrew the version of myself that thought being invisible was safer than being seen. The vase is gone. The fortune, such as it was, crumbled under the weight of my father's magical thinking and Helena's greed. Victoria's privilege evaporated when the money stopped flowing. And I'm here, free, whole, building beauty from broken things. That's not luck. That's not magic. That's just choosing, finally, to save myself instead of waiting for someone else to decide I was worth saving. Last week, a museum in my mother's hometown asked me to consult on a collection of Qing dynasty porcelain. Among the pieces was a vase almost identical to the one my family had worshipped. Same period, same style, same painted cranes ascending toward clouds. I held it carefully, professionally, examined it for damage, documented its condition. It was beautiful. I appreciated its craftsmanship, its history, its survival through centuries. Then I set it down, finished my report, and went home. Because it was just a vase. Beautiful, yes. Valuable, certainly. But just an object. Just porcelain. Nothing worth sacrificing a life for. Nothing worth worshipping. Nothing that could determine my worth or my future. I didn't destroy my family by breaking their vase. I freed myself from the belief that their fortune mattered more than my existence. Everything that followed, their financial decline, their loss of status, their unravelling, those were consequences of their own choices, their own weakness, their own refusal to see reality. I didn't push them into ruin. I just stepped out of the way and let their house of cards collapse under its own weight. And when the dust settled, I was already gone, building something real, something mine, something that couldn't be broken by accident or intention. They thought the vase was their fortune. They were wrong. I was. And they broke me first. The difference is I knew how to put myself back together.